Daniel had been walking for hours under the twin suns when he finally saw the tall walls of the alien city. The gates stood like giants, made of stone and glowing metal, guarded by soldiers in heavy armor. He had traveled far to reach this place, not for war or riches, but because he wanted to understand the people who lived here. Stories had always said that these aliens were fierce, proud, and quick to test the strength of anyone who stepped on their land. Still, Daniel was not afraid. He had seen hardship before, and his courage had been tested many times back on Earth. The streets of the city were busy. Traders shouted in their strange tongue, selling bright fabrics, metal carvings, and fruits that glowed in the sun. Children ran barefoot through the dust, laughing and chasing each other. Daniel walked slowly, trying not to draw attention, but his human face and simple clothes already made him stand out among the tall, armored locals. Many eyes followed him, some curious, some suspicious. He greeted a few with a polite nod, but most looked away or whispered to each other. Outsiders were rare here, and a human was almost unheard of. As Daniel made his way deeper into the city, a loud crash suddenly echoed down the street. A cart had overturned, spilling its load of heavy barrels. One rolled dangerously close to a child, who stood frozen in fear. Without thinking, Daniel sprinted forward, grabbed the barrel with both hands, and pulled the child out of the way. The barrel hit the ground with a dull thud, rolling harmlessly aside. The child's mother rushed over, hugging her daughter tightly. For a brief moment, the crowd fell silent, watching the human who had saved one of their own. Murmurs spread quickly. Some looked at him with surprise, others with quiet approval, but not everyone was pleased. From the other side of the street, a tall figure in black armor stepped forward. His presence silenced the whispers at once. This was Koresh, the guard commander, known as one of the strongest warriors in the city. His name alone carried weight, for he had fought in countless battles and protected their people for years. His golden eyes locked onto Daniel, studying him with suspicion and a hint of challenge. "You," Koresh said, his deep voice echoing through the street. "Human. You act brave before the eyes of my people. But I wonder, are you truly brave or only lucky?" The crowd gasped. No one had expected the commander to speak to the outsider directly. Daniel stood tall, meeting the alien's gaze calmly. He could feel the tension in the air. The people were waiting, curious to see how he would respond. Koresh stepped closer, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. "If you are as strong as you seem, then prove it. Fight me, here, before all." The silence grew heavier. A fight with the commander was not a small matter. No outsider would dare accept such a challenge. Most would beg forgiveness, step back, or leave the city altogether. The aliens in the crowd leaned forward, expecting the human to bow his head, in fear. But Daniel did not. He had faced danger before, faced storms and loss, and he knew what it meant to stand his ground. His heart beat fast, but his mind was clear. Slowly, he took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "I accept." The crowd erupted in shouts of disbelief. Some laughed, calling him a fool. Others whispered that maybe he had courage after all. Mothers pulled their children back, fearing what would happen next. Koresh narrowed his eyes, clearly not expecting such a quick answer. He tilted his head, almost amused. "You accept without hesitation?" the commander asked, his tone heavy with disbelief. Daniel nodded. "A man must stand when he is called. I will not run." For a moment, Koresh studied him in silence. Then a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, not of kindness, but of interest. The commander raised his arm and signaled to his guards. "Prepare the arena," he commanded. "At first light, the human will face me." The crowd roared, voices mixing in excitement, doubt, and fear. Some shouted that the human would not last a single strike. Others cheered for the chance to witness something new. Daniel stood quietly as the guards led him away, his heart steady. He had no idea how strong this alien commander truly was, but he knew one thing. He could not back down now. That night, word spread across the city like wildfire. In the markets, in the taverns, in the homes of the people, the same story was told again and again. A human had dared to accept the commander's challenge. Some called him foolish, some called him brave, but all agreed. They would be there, to watch. The arena would be full. Daniel sat alone in the guest chamber they gave him, staring at the stars outside the window. He thought of his home, of the long road that had brought him here, and of the challenge waiting at dawn. He was not the strongest, not the tallest, not even the best fighter. But he carried something he believed was stronger than weapons or armor. He carried determination. He whispered to himself, "No matter what happens tomorrow, I will stand my ground." And with that thought, he closed his eyes, ready for whatever the morning would bring. The night was long and Daniel could hardly sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined the crowd, the roar of thousands of voices, and the shining figure of the commander standing before him. Yet no fear touched his heart. Instead, a steady determination kept him awake. He had agreed to the challenge, and now he must prepare. The room he stayed in was simple. There was a wooden bench, a table with a pitcher of water, and a small lamp that gave off a soft, bluish glow. Daniel sat at the table and took out the only belongings he carried: a small notebook, a worn piece of cloth, and a staff made from strong wood. It was not a weapon of glory like the commander's massive blade, but it had been with him on many journeys. He touched it with care, as if drawing strength from its smooth surface. Outside, the city was alive even in the late hours. People filled the streets telling each other about the human who had accepted the commander's call. Some believed he would be destroyed in moments. Others whispered that he might have hidden strength otherwise. Why would he accept without hesitation? In taverns, bets were made. Merchants argued over what would happen. Children practiced pretending to be the human in their games, shouting bravely before falling to the ground in laughter. Daniel listened to the noise faintly through the window. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him even though he was alone. He knew that tomorrow was not only about him and Koresh, it was about what humans represented in this world. If he fell too easily, it would prove what many already believed, that humans were weak, unworthy of respect. But if he stood his ground even in defeat, he could show them something different. He leaned back, remembering his mentor from long ago, an old soldier named Marcus, who had trained him in survival and discipline. Marcus used to say, "Strength is not about breaking stones with your fists. Strength is about standing when everything tells you to fall." Those words came back to Daniel now, and he repeated them softly to himself. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Commander Koresh was also preparing. He stood in the training hall, surrounded by guards and apprentices. His armor gleamed under the torchlight, and his massive blade cut the air with sharp movements. Sparks flew as he struck against practice dummies made of ironwood. Each strike was powerful enough to split stone, and the soldiers watching felt both awe and fear. One of his captains spoke carefully. "Commander, do you truly mean to fight the human? He cannot match you. It will be no contest." Koresh stopped, lowering his blade. His golden eyes glowed with thought. "That is what you think." But he accepted without hesitation. "I have fought many enemies, and I know what fear looks like." The human showed none. Either he is a fool, or he is brave. I intend to find out. He dismissed the guards and continued training alone, testing his speed, his balance, his focus. Though he was confident in his strength, a small spark of curiosity burned within him. This was not just about victory. This was about testing the unknown. Back in his chamber, Daniel prepared in his own way. He did not lift heavy weapons or practice brute strength. Instead, he focused on calm breathing, balance, and agility. He moved his staff slowly through the air, practicing steps and dodges, turning his body lightly as if he were already facing an opponent. He knew he could not match Koresh in size or power. His only chance was to use speed, awareness, and clever thinking. As the hours passed, Daniel's mind became steady like water. He remembered times when he had faced storms at sea, times when he had stood against stronger men who underestimated him. He remembered the day he lost everything he loved and how he had stood again after the loss. All of those moments had been preparing him for this. When dawn finally broke, the city was already awake. The air was filled with excitement and people hurried toward the arena. It was a great stone structure carved into the ground and rising high into the sky, with seats that could hold thousands. Banners flew from tall poles, and drums beat steadily, calling everyone to gather. Merchants lined the paths to the arena, selling food and trinkets. Children waved small flags with the commander's emblem. Guards kept order as the crowd pressed closer, eager for the fight. The news had spread beyond the city. Even travelers from nearby lands had come to see the human face their mighty commander. Daniel walked toward the arena with a calm step. His simple clothes and wooden staff looked small compared to the shining armor of the guards who escorted him. People pointed and whispered as he passed. Some mocked him, calling him doomed. Others clapped quietly, admiring his courage. He did not look at them. His eyes stayed forward, steady, as if nothing could shake him. Koresh, on the other hand, entered the arena from the opposite gate. The crowd roared at the sight of him. His armor gleamed like fire, and his blade rested easily in his hands. He looked like a living statue of war towering above all. His presence alone sent shivers through the crowd. But Koresh did not smile. His eyes searched across the arena until they found Daniel, standing calmly with his staff. In that moment, the commander felt something unusual. This was not a trembling man about to meet his death. This was someone who had already accepted it, and in that acceptance he found strength. The drums grew louder, and the announcer's voice echoed across the arena, declaring the fight that everyone had been waiting for. A human against the guard, commander. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the first strike, and Daniel, with his heart steady, whispered the same words he had repeated all night. I will stand my ground. The sound of the drums shook the air as Daniel stepped into the arena. The ground beneath his feet was packed sand, marked with scars from battles fought long before. The rising sun cast golden light across the stone walls, and every seat was filled with aliens of all sizes and ranks. Thousands of eyes were fixed on him, many doubtful, some curious, and only a few hopeful. Daniel could feel their gaze like a heavy weight, but he walked steadily toward the center. He carried only his wooden staff, light in his hands, but strong enough to serve him if used with skill. From the opposite gate, the commander entered. Koresh's appearance drew a roar from the crowd. His armor shone like molten metal, carved with the marks of his victories. His massive blade rested against his shoulder, as if it weighed nothing. His golden eyes swept across the arena, then locked on Daniel. For a moment there was silence, as if even the air itself bowed to the power of the commander. Daniel and Koresh faced each other in the circle of sand. The announcer's voice rang out, naming Koresh as the undefeated commander of the guard and Daniel as the outsider who had dared to accept the challenge. The crowd cheered Koresh's name, their voices rising like thunder. Only a handful dared to shout for Daniel, their voices swallowed in the noise. Koresh spoke first, his tone heavy but calm. You stand before me, human. I give you this chance. Step aside, and you may leave with your life. Daniel's grip tightened on his staff, but his voice was steady. I came here to stand, not to run. Begin when you are ready. A faint smile touched Koresh's lips, though his eyes remained sharp. So be it. The drums stopped, and silence fell. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Koresh advanced, his massive blade sweeping through the air with a sound like rushing wind. Daniel dodged quickly, the blade slamming into the ground where he had stood only moments before. The impact shook the arena floor, and sand flew into the air. The crowd roared with excitement, certain the human would not last long. Daniel kept moving, circling lightly, his staff ready. He knew he could not block the commander's strikes directly. They carried the strength of a mountain. Instead, he focused on avoiding, watching carefully for small openings. Each time Koresh swung, Daniel slipped aside, his feet barely touching the ground. The crowd's laughter grew at first, mocking the human who ran like a rabbit. But as the minutes passed, they began to notice something. Daniel was not simply fleeing, he was studying. His eyes followed every motion, every shift of Koresh's weight. Koresh, realizing this, struck faster. His blade cut through the air again and again, forcing Daniel to bend, twist, and roll across the sand. Once, the tip of the sword grazed Daniel's arm, leaving a shallow cut. The crowd cheered at the sight of blood, but Daniel ignored it. He rose to his feet and continued moving. Then came Daniel's first strike. As Koresh swung wide, Daniel dashed forward, spinning his staff and striking against the commander's armored side. The sound echoed like wood against stone. Koresh did not fall, but the blow made him pause for a moment. The crowd gasped, surprised that the human had even touched their commander. Koresh's eyes narrowed, and his respect for Daniel grew a little. "Clever," he said quietly. The battle continued. Daniel's staff snapped forward again and again, striking where the armor was weakest, at the joints, the back of the knee, the elbow. None of the blows were enough to defeat Koresh, but together they slowed him, forced him to fight harder than he had expected. The commander's breathing grew heavier, his strikes more focused. The crowd's mood shifted. No longer did they laugh at the human. Instead, they leaned forward, eyes wide, shouting in excitement. Each time Daniel dodged a crushing blow, the tension rose. Every strike he landed, no matter how small, drew gasps and cries. The fight had become more than entertainment. It was a test of will, a struggle between strength and spirit. At one point, Koresh swung with all his might, and Daniel ducked under the blade. The force of the strike broke the stone wall behind him, sending rubble crashing down. A heavy piece of stone fell toward Koresh, who had no time to move. Without thinking, Daniel leaped forward, using his staff to push the stone aside before it struck the commander. The crowd fell silent in shock. Koresh looked at him, breathing hard. "You saved me," he said slowly. Daniel nodded, gripping his staff tightly. "I came here to fight you, not to see you crushed by the arena." The commander's golden eyes studied him, and something changed in his expression. For the first time, true respect flickered in his gaze, but the fight was not over. Koresh raised his blade again, this time with full focus. Daniel steadied himself, ready to face whatever came. The crowd roared once more, swept away by the sight of the human who would not fall. The clash of staff against blade filled the arena, echoing like thunder under the suns. Daniel's arms ached, his breath came heavy, but he did not stop. Each movement was driven by more than survival. It was driven by the need to prove that humans were not weak, that courage was a power of its own. As the sun climbed higher, the two warriors stood in the sand facing each other, neither willing to give in. The crowd, who had come expecting to see the human crushed, now watched in awe. They saw not just a battle, but a meeting of two worlds, one of raw strength, the other of steady determination. And though the fight was far from finished, one truth had already been made clear. Daniel had earned his place in the arena. The sun burned hotter above the arena, and the fight grew heavier with every passing moment. Dust rose from the sand, mixing with the roar of thousands of voices. Daniel's arms ached from swinging his staff again and again, and his legs trembled from constant movement. Sweat ran down his face, stinging his eyes, but his spirit did not bend. Across from him, Commander Koresh stood tall, his golden eyes fixed on the human. His armor bore scratches from Daniel's strikes, and his breathing had grown louder, but his strength remained as terrifying as ever. The crowd shouted for their commander, yet many could not hide their amazement. No outsider had ever lasted this long against Koresh. Daniel had not only survived, he had matched him, forcing the commander to fight with true effort. Koresh lifted his blade, pointing it at Daniel. "You fight with more than skill, human. You fight with heart. But heart alone cannot win." Daniel wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. His voice was steady, though his body felt heavy. "Maybe not, but sometimes heart is enough to carry a man further than anyone expects." The crowd fell silent for a moment at those words. Then Koresh charged again, his blade cutting through the air with crushing force. Daniel twisted aside, the tip of the sword grazing his shoulder. Pain shot through him, but he did not cry out. Instead, he spun his staff low, striking the commander's leg. Koresh staggered slightly, and the crowd gasped. The fight became a storm. Koresh's strikes were like thunder, heavy and loud. Daniel's movements were like the wind, quick and light. Blow after blow rang out across the arena. Sometimes Koresh's strength forced Daniel to stumble back, nearly falling. Other times Daniel's clever steps and quick staff forced Koresh to adjust. Then came a moment that stunned the entire arena. Koresh swung his blade with such power that Daniel's staff cracked under the impact. A long line split down its length, and the human barely managed to hold onto it. The crowd cheered, certain the fight was now over, but instead of giving up, Daniel adjusted his grip and stood firm. Even with a broken weapon, he refused to bow. Something changed in Koresh's eyes. Then, he no longer looked at Daniel as a fragile outsider. He looked at him as a warrior. Each strike after that was filled not with arrogance but with respect. He fought not to humiliate, but to truly test the man who stood before him. During one clash, the ground shook, and part of the arena wall cracked from the force. Stones broke loose and began to fall toward the fighters. Daniel saw the danger and acted without thinking. He pushed Koresh aside, shielding him from the falling debris. The crowd gasped as dust filled the air. When it cleared, Daniel stood, his chest heaving, his staff splintered further, but his eyes still fierce. Koresh looked at him with surprise. "You saved me again, even in the middle of battle." Daniel answered simply, "Honor is worth more than victory." For a long moment, Koresh said nothing. Then, with a deep breath, he raised his blade once more. His strikes came slower now, more controlled, as if he wanted to test Daniel's spirit rather than crush him. The fight continued, until both men were covered in sweat and dust, their movement slower but their eyes locked in determination. The crowd no longer shouted mockery. They cheered both names, the commanders and the humans. They had come expecting a simple show of power, but what they witnessed was something greater, respect being forged in the fire of battle. When Koresh finally stepped back, lowering his blade, Daniel stood ready, his cracked staff trembling in his hands. For a moment it seemed the fight would go on forever. But then Koresh gave a small nod. "You have earned more than survival, human," he said. "You have earned my respect." The crowd erupted in thunderous applause. The fight had not ended with one lying broken in the sand, but with something far greater, the recognition of equals. Daniel lowered his staff slowly, his chest still heaving, and nodded back. The two warriors stood there, not as enemies but as men who had tested each other and found something deeper than victory. The sun was sinking when the crowd finally began to leave the arena. Word spread quickly through the city. The human had faced the commander and endured. It was a story that would be told again and again, in markets, in homes, and in songs. Children played in the streets, pretending to be Daniel, shouting, "I accept," before charging into their games. Merchants spoke with pride of having seen the fight. Even those who had mocked Daniel earlier now spoke his name with respect. That evening, Daniel sat quietly outside the arena, his cracked staff resting across his knees. His body ached, every muscle sore, but inside he felt a calm pride. He had not defeated Koresh, but he had stood his ground, and that was enough. Koresh approached, no longer wearing his armor. Without the weight of his weapon, he seemed less like a towering commander and more like a man. He stopped beside Daniel and looked down at him for a long moment. "You fought with courage and wisdom," Koresh said. "You have shown my people that strength is not only measured by muscle and steel. It is also measured by the will to stand." Daniel smiled faintly. "And you showed me that respect is earned in the hardest places. I did not come here to be a hero. I only came to stand when called." Koresh extended his hand. After a moment, Daniel reached out and clasped it. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of everything they had endured. The commander of the guard and the human traveler, once strangers, now shared a bond forged in the arena. From that day forward, Daniel was no longer seen as just an outsider. In the city, he was spoken of as a warrior, a brother in arms, someone who had faced their strongest and stood with honor. And though his journey was far from over, this moment would remain with him forever. For Daniel, the fight had not been about victory or defeat. It had been about proving that even in the face of overwhelming power, a man could choose courage. And for Koresh, it had been about discovering that true strength could exist in the most unexpected places. The arena had begun as a place of challenge. It ended as the beginning of friendship.